Nigeria is often called the giant of Africa. It has one of the continent's largest economies, a booming creative industry, and a democratic system that has survived 2 decades of elections. But there's something quietly slipping through the cracks, something fundamental to our practice of democracy. That is freedom of the press. In the past 10 years, from 2015 to 2025, Nigeria has gone through one of the sharpest declines in press freedom anywhere in West Africa. From journalists getting arrested, newsrooms raided, TV stations fined millions for covering protests, and in one particular case, a journalist simply disappeared for 2 years. Now, I want to tell you the story of how it all happened. The laws, the politics, the fear. But this will also be about the people who kept reporting anyway, even when it could cost them everything. This is the story of how press freedom is dying a slow and painful death in Nigeria. In 2015, Nigerians voted in a new president, Muhammadu Buhari. But he wasn't exactly new. This was a former general, brutal in all sense of the word, who once ruled Nigeria as a military dictator in the 1980s. And journalists from that era remembered him quite well. Back then, he jailed reporters, banned critical outlets, and passed laws that made embarrassing the government a criminal offense. So when Buhari won the 2015 general election, this time as a Democrat, a lot of people asked, what has changed? At first, the numbers looked stable. Nigeria was ranked 111th in the world for press freedom. Not great, I know, but not catastrophic either. However, within months, subtle warning signs began to flash. The alarm bell started ringing when, in that same year, a new law came into force, the Cybercrime Act. This was supposed to fight online fraud, but buried in there was a vague, dangerous clause, one that made it illegal to send messages considered grossly offensive or that could cause annoyance. That is the clause that would be used against journalists. By the end of 2015, reporters writing about corruption or armed separatist groups began facing threats and interrogations. The gloves were coming off slowly. July 2016, a journalist named Jones Abiri gets a knock on his door. Moments later, he disappears. No arrest warrant, no court case, just vanished into the custody of Nigeria's secret police, the DSS. For 2 years, no one knew where he was, not his family, not even his lawyer. His crime was allegedly publishing stories of oil corruption in the Niger Delta. The authorities saw that as dangerous. But this wasn't just an arrest. They were making a statement, sending a message, and it was pretty clear. If you cross certain lines, we won't just jail you, we just might erase you completely. That same year, the Nigerian army declared another journalist, Ahmad Salkida, wanted, just for reporting on Boko Haram. He wasn't part of the group. He wasn't even advocating for them. He was just doing his job, investigating insurgency. By 2017, Nigeria had dropped into what Reporters Without Borders (RSF) calls the red zone, where journalism is badly threatened. And on the ground, that threat was getting real. In January 2017, armed police stormed the offices of Premium Times, an investigative news outlet. They arrested the editor, Dapo Olorunyomi, and a reporter. Their crime was publishing reports about the military that the army didn't like. Nigeria wasn't just going after militant propaganda or fake news now. They were going after serious journalism that held the state accountable. And it wasn't just federal. State governors, especially in places like Kaduna and Ebonyi, started jailing reporters too. RSF called them the most determined persecutors of the press. Report something that makes a local official look bad, you might end up in court if lucky, or in a cell, and if not so lucky, you just disappear. By the end of 2017, more and more journalists were going quiet. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they were scared to say it out. By 2018, Nigeria's press freedom ranking had gone up slightly, but that was misleading. Because you see, on the ground, things were getting worse. Samuel Ogundipe, a reporter who was working with Premium Times, was arrested after publishing a leaked memo about misconduct by Nigeria's secret police. The authorities didn't deny the story. They just wanted to know who talked. When he refused to give up his source, he was charged under the Cybercrime Act. Remember that same vague cyber stalking law from 2015? Yeah, it came in handy here. This law was becoming the government's favorite weapon, and the message was clear. If we can't scare you, we will jail you.
Samuel was recently arrested
for writing that story. They accused me of publishing, stealing secrets, official secrets of the government. But by the time I was charged with for contradicting sections of the penal code.
Then came 2019, an election year, and it marked a dramatic escalation. First, in January, armed soldiers raided the Daily Trust newspaper in Abuja and Maiduguri. But why? One might wonder. Well, they reported on military operations in the northeast. Then, without warning, the place was stormed by armed men of the military, computers seized, staff detained. This was one of Nigeria's biggest newspapers, and it was being shut down by force. Human Rights Watch criticized this move, but no one was listening. This wasn't just censorship anymore. Things were heading towards a militarized censorship zone. In June, the government suspended AIT and Ray Power, accusing them of inciting broadcasts. Fun fact, these were opposition-friendly stations. And that was what made this moment so dangerous. Press freedom was becoming a partisan weapon. Then in August, Omoyele Sowore, journalist and activist, was arrested for organizing peaceful protests, charged with treason, held for months. Even after courts ordered his release, the government refused. That same month, another journalist, Agba Jalingo, published a report on 500 million naira allegedly mismanaged by a state governor. 4 days later, he was arrested, held in chains, charged with treason and cybercrime. Now, this was how it works. You publish a story, a politician gets angry. Suddenly, you are being called a traitor. By the end of 2019, at least 19 journalists had been arrested or assaulted. One reporter, Precious Owolabi, just 23 years old, was shot dead while covering a protest. 2019 was a tipping point. The gloves were finally off. If you were a journalist in Nigeria, you weren't just reporting news anymore. You were taking a huge risk. Then came 2020, when the pandemic hit Nigeria in early 2020. Lockdowns, panic, and uncertainty were in the air. But even during the pandemic, some stories still had to be told. However, in March, photojournalists trying to document lockdown enforcement in Abuja were beaten by police officers. In Ebonyi, a local reporter was arrested for covering a Lassa fever outbreak, accused of spreading panic. The government had new emergency laws, and they started using them to criminalize routine reporting. In May, a journalist from Niger Live TV was abducted at 1 a.m., blindfolded, interrogated, with no warrant, no charges. And then, in October, the press faced its greatest test yet. The EndSARS protests exploded across the country. Young Nigerians were demanding an end to police brutality, and journalists were there documenting every moment. But as the protests grew, so did the crackdown. Pelumi Onifade was just 20 years old, a young journalist covering the protest for an online news platform. One day, he filmed a scene involving a government task force in Lagos. He was arrested on the spot. Days later, his body was found in a morgue. Pelumi was doing his job. He was unarmed, but this didn't matter to whoever finished the job. The young man never made it home. And while the nation grieved, the government was tightening the screws. The media regulator, the NBC, fined 3 major TV stations for their protest coverage. Their crime was simply broadcasting unverified footage of soldiers shooting protesters at Lekki toll gates. They didn't deny the shootings, they just didn't want you to see them. This was a turning point. The state was now boldly punishing the press for telling the truth. Even international outlets like CNN were threatening with sanctions. The government accused them of fake news, but the footage spoke for itself. By the end of 2020, Nigeria's press freedom rank technically rose. However, journalists knew better. This was one of the darkest years in living memory.
Nigeria has banned Twitter indefinitely.
The social media platform had deleted a tweet by President Muhammadu Buhari.
In June 2021, Nigeria's government banned Twitter completely because Twitter deleted a tweet from President Buhari, one they said violated rules on inciting violence. So the response was to shut down the whole platform. Overnight, millions of Nigerians, including journalists, lost a vital tool. Newsrooms went silent on the platform. The embassy told broadcasters to deactivate their Twitter accounts in the national interest. Now, think about that for a moment. A democratic government told the media, stop using this platform or else. Some reporters used VPNs to keep working. But the Attorney General reportedly threatened to prosecute anyone still tweeting. Even if no one was arrested, the fear was real. In that same month, the government tried to pass new laws, giving itself sweeping powers to license and sanction the press. Meanwhile, journalists kept being arrested for stories published online. Channels TV was fined for airing the wrong guest. People's Gazette, an online outlet, published an expose, and suddenly this website went dark, blocked by telecoms. No court order, no explanation whatsoever. Nigeria was testing the tools of digital authoritarianism, blocking sites, banning platforms, surveilling reporters. Investigators allegedly discovered the government had quietly acquired spyware technology, and journalists suspected their phones were being tapped. By 2022, Nigeria dropped to its worst press freedom ranking in decades, 129 out of 180 countries. This was the lowest in West Africa. And this wasn't just about jailing reporters anymore. It seemed like the government was out to control the entire information space. Ahead of the 2023 elections, attacks on journalists surged again. Reporters were beating at political rallies, newsrooms were threatened, and journalists were being charged under the same old laws: cybercrime, terrorism, even criminal defamation. The press, which was supposed to cover stories, was fast becoming the story. 2023, another election year, and once again journalists were on the front lines. In Lagos, Arrest TV's crew was assaulted at a polling station. Across the country, over 20 journalists were attacked or detained. Nigeria's elections were never just about votes. They were about power, and whoever tried to question that power, especially with a camera, got hit. In May 2023, a new president was sworn in, Bola Tinubu. And for a moment, it felt like things might change. 1 month before Tinubu took office, journalist Agba Jalingo, who had been on trial for nearly 4 years, was finally acquitted. No evidence of a crime, just journalism. For the first time in years, Nigeria's press freedom ranking improved from 129 to 112. A glimmer of hope, right? Then, in early 2024, the government amended the Cybercrime Act, narrowing the infamous cyber-stalking clause. A win after years of campaigning, right? But here's the thing about hope in Nigeria. It usually comes with a but. August 2024, cost of living protests broke out across Nigerian cities. Police responded with tear gas, bullets, and beatings. At least 56 journalists were attacked or detained in just a few days. One reporter, Yakubu Mohammed, said he was punched, locked up, and told to shut up or disappear. The same playbook, different administration. In Kaduna, a journalist was jailed just for taking photos of a police operation. In Anambra, another was detained for 18 days after writing about a businessman. And remember Pelumi Onifade, the journalist killed during NSAS protest? 4 years after his death, Pelumi's family was still fighting to get his remains released. No one had been held accountable. Yes, there were reforms. Yes, some old cases were dropped. But at the local level, the harassment never stopped. Nigeria dropped off the Global Impunity Index, but that wasn't because justice was served. It was because fewer journalists were being killed. Now, they were just being jailed or silenced forever. And it turned out the war against the press didn't end, it only evolved. Now it's 2025, a decade since the story began. Even though the administration has changed, it is still more of the same. In March, 2 journalists in Kano State were arrested, again for writing about a local commissioner. No violence, no incitement, just a critical article. And that's the part we don't talk about enough. It's not always the federal government. It's not always sweeping laws or military raids. Sometimes it's a single phone call from a governor, a commissioner, or a local police chief. And that's enough to get a journalist locked up. Nigeria's new ranking is expected soon. Some believe the reforms will help. Others say, don't hold your breath. Because while laws have been tweaked, the culture hasn't changed. This decade was defined by attacks, but also by resistance. By the journalists who kept reporting, by the lawyers who kept defending, and by the citizens who kept watching. Press freedom isn't just about journalists. It's about your right to know, to ask, to speak, to hold the government accountable. And in Nigeria, that right is still being fought for by the many brave reporters out in the field, working hard to hold this government accountable. To those who laid down their lives while practicing what they loved, this is to their memory. We will always remember. This vital fight for transparency and accountability continues, with Nigerian journalists and advocates standing firm on the front lines against an ever-evolving threat to press freedom. A vigilance especially critical as the nation looks towards the 2027 general elections. So, will we see something different or just more of the same? I'm Jude Bella, and this is Declassified on News Central TV. Thanks for watching.